Hello again, everybody. It's time to continue our look at the biblical view of homosexuality and specifically digging into the scriptures as our first step. And then there are questions we can wrestle through in terms of what to do about what the scriptures have said to us. But our first step of the process is what do the scriptures say? Because again, remember, our mission is to understand what has our King said about this, because we want to do what he said. And that, of course, leads into what has he said how to deal with people who are struggling with this issue. But first, we want to understand ourselves. So, what has our King said, and how should we understand this issue as we interact with a world that's struggling to understand it as well? So, we're going to be looking at a few texts this morning that are pretty controversial, and this is really getting to some of the meat and potatoes of the scriptural picture of homosexuality as a practice. One of the questions that was brought up in the last video, which I really appreciate the questions and the interaction, had to do with, so how do we define homosexuality? Like, should we be doing that? Or should people who are in that, if you want to call it lifestyle, or who feel that's a part of their identity, should we let them define what homosexuality means? And that's a good question. For now, what we're going to be doing is letting the scriptures define it for us, in so much as, what did God say about the behavior? Did he say anything about the feelings associated with it, the attraction part of it? What is it that God dealt with? That's where we want to start. So in terms of how do we define it, let's start there. And then once we've looked at the scriptural pictures, we'll work through some of those questions in terms of everyday life in our society, our culture. And people do define it differently. And that's really important, actually, because having a discussion about anything, you've got to start with, are we talking about the same thing here? Otherwise, you just miss each other like boats in the night. So last time we took a look at the Genesis portions of Scripture that are associated with this. So Genesis chapter 1. Is that really a helpful text in trying to identify what God thinks and his approach to the question of homosexuality? It has, of course, something to say about it in terms of God's original design of male-female, his command to be fruitful and multiply, but it doesn't really answer the question for us, because there are other lifestyle choices that God has said he honors. One example being singleness, that Jesus, his son, for instance, chose singleness, didn't have a wife, he wasn't fruitful and didn't multiply through physical children, and yet God honored that. That was a godly, kingdom-centered way of life for Jesus. So we can't just say, because that's God's original design, that's how everyone ought to be. So Genesis 1, as I concluded at least, isn't a great place to go to try to find God's vision of this topic of homosexuality. Then we looked at Genesis chapter 19 and surrounding ideas regarding Sodom, because that has been brought up. And I don't think it's at the forefront of the conversation as much as it used to be. But the example of Sodom, where people in Sodom, the men, young and old, were wanting to be violent towards and abusive towards and rape two male, what they thought were men, actually were angels. That story doesn't really focus on whether two people of the same gender can share a loving, faithful, monogamous sexual life together. That wasn't really the issue on the table. So at least as I was presenting it, I concluded that's not a very helpful text either to deal with what we're talking about, because what we're trying to wrestle through in terms of societal questions, especially as the church is wrestling through the question of homosexuality, is we're really trying to wrestle through whether God approves of and accepts, even some would say has gifted, people who belong to his son, Jesus, the way of life where a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, can be in a committed, monogamous sexual relationship, specifically in marriage, if and when that's allowed. So we're trying to answer that question. That's the question the churches seem to be wrestling through. I think that's the more pertinent question because, as I said, promiscuity isn't really debated, whether that God's in favor of that, whether he blesses that. So that's what we're doing. Now, let's get straight to the text because there's so much to unpack here. As I was studying this, I, I said to myself and a few other people, what have I gotten myself into? I want to be real careful here because people on both sides of the question, and I'm sure there's more than two sides, but to simplify, people on both sides of this question, both those who say God's clearly against homosexual behavior versus those who say God accepts and blesses proper homosexual behavior, they'll turn to these texts and really make it sound super simple. On the one hand, people will look at these texts, and I'll read them for you in a moment, and say, this is as black and white as it gets. God couldn't be any clearer. He clearly thinks this is, to use the NIV term, detestable, to use the older language, an abomination. Like, how much clearer could God be, right? And they think it's an open shut case right there. People on the side of acceptance and approval of the homosexual experience, they would say, now, this is a part of the Old Testament, first of all, which isn't enforced anymore in the lives of disciples of Jesus in the New Covenant. And secondly, the word abomination used here is also used of eating food that was considered unclean. So homosexuality is an abomination, meaning activity that's mentioned here. That activity is as great an abomination as eating shellfish. So really, is that the case you want to make here? And I think both arguments dismiss this way too quickly because as I'm looking into this, this is some heavy stuff. So let me read to you the two texts in question. Again, these are found in Leviticus. One is found in chapter 18, verse 22. And this is the law of God given to the nation of Israel through Moses, the great deliverer, but also lawgiver. And so he's gone up onto Mount Sinai. Now, this is really important to remember for context. When he went up to receive the law from God on Mount Sinai, Moses was himself not the one writing the law. This isn't Moses coming up with what he thinks Israel ought to do, what's best for Israel. So Moses isn't the lawmaker, he's the lawgiver, which means he's received it from God and he's passing it along to Israel. That's the biblical testimony. Now, of course, people aren't going to believe the biblical testimony, and so they'll find other rationalistic, naturalistic ways to explain where the law came from. But we're dealing with the Bible as it's presented, okay? And it's presented, the testimony is that God gave this law to Israel, but he gave it through Moses. So if we can agree at the outset of looking at these texts that these are God's words to his people, I think that'll really streamline. Because we can't really get caught up in the debate of whether God gave this or Moses gave this at this point. Because we're really trying to wrestle through most precisely what the disciples of Jesus ought to do with this question. Because we as the churches want to be clear ourselves so that we can help the world see the truth clearly. It's a whole different conversation whether this is Moses's idea and Moses's thought or somebody that claimed to be Moses later, however the conversation goes. So let's assume that the testimony of Scripture is true. I think that is correct, that God is saying these things to Israel. Now, this is what he says. This is a specific verse, Leviticus 18:22. Do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is detestable. Now, that's the NIV. The word detestable there is used there as an adjective. It's actually a noun there in the Hebrew, so probably better translated, that is a detestable thing. Okay. Now, in the older language, the King James Version, for instance, it would say that is an abomination. And that's really a catchword for a lot of people because that's really strong language. We're going to be looking at that word because that is actually a huge part of this consideration. What is meant by abomination? And it may not be as simple as Some would like it to be. Now, going to Leviticus 20, verse 13, this will sound very familiar from what we just read in Leviticus 18. And here the words are these: if a man has sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. In other words, if you break what I told you back, what we would call chapter 18, both of them, both men, have done what is detestable or have done an abomination. They are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. Wow. So you see what I mean? Some people, they read those two in isolation and they're like, I don't know how there could be any argument or debate about this. And actually, there is more weight to these statements than some would like to admit. But I want to say at the outset, I am not trying to, as I said before, I'm not trying to win points for either side. I personally would like it to be true that God accepts and is very happy about monogamous, faithful, homosexual relationship, just as he is monogamous, faithful, heterosexual relationship in the beautiful vision of marriage. That's my preference. For the sake of people I know and love, for the sake of a lot of people who claim Christ, who are in that boat and think that way, I want that to be true. But my mission here is not to prove that what I want is right or anyone else wants is right. My whole mission here, personally, is to just try to figure out what my King has said, and just have invited you to be a part of the process with me. I got to wrestle with these texts here. And it's not as simple as, well, that's the Old Testament, so nor is it as simple as God said it, so what else can we say about it? So let's dig into the language here, because I think this matters a lot. Though I'm a New Testament, New Covenant follower of Jesus, here's one thing that we have to be really clear about in our own minds as we discuss these texts. Does the Old Covenant law of God to Israel, does it reveal anything about God's heart and mind regarding things in social life, human interaction? Now, there's two parts to the law, and we want to make sure we're identifying these clearly. One part of the law is what we would call cultic, which means religious and worship related. So there's a whole lot of the law in Exodus to Deuteronomy that deals with how to worship God appropriately, which sacrifices to bring, what the priests ought to be doing, what you are and are not allowed to do when you approach God's tabernacle or later his temple, the festivals, all those things that are specifically how do you approach God for worship, right? As a community, as individuals. That's cultic, to use the technical language there. Then there's the social, or the how to interact with your neighbor laws. And this is where the question comes in of, towards whom should you be sexual? And God was really explicit. I mean, I'm picking out Leviticus 18:22 to read to you, but that's a part of an entire chapter almost of clear, delineated guidelines about sexual life. Because remember, God is not giving individuals moral laws. He is giving an entire nation a law book of covenants. So that's like the U.S. law code, the California law code, the Pennsylvania law code, like anywhere you go where there's a large number of people living together under a government, there's a law code. That's what God's giving. A lot of it is moral in nature. What's right, what's wrong. Some of it is just what works best in society and culture. And so if we aren't working hard to clarify, is this cultic or social? Is this moral, or is this what works best in your societal life together? We're going to get really messed up. And so that was a big part of my studying here. And boy, it's hours of studying to try to get this right. We've got to be clear together. Is God saying, you, Israel, specifically, because you're my people, just so that you're different from all those other people, here are some guidelines? Or is this God saying, across the boards, this is what moral sexuality looks like. Here's what immoral sexuality looks like. So let me give you an idea here of what I'm talking about. In Leviticus 18, and I hope you have Bibles handy, or we'll look at these later. But if you look at Leviticus 18, it's been pointed out, and I was listening to people's commentary on this. I'm trying to get an understanding from all sides as well as I can how people are viewing this. A lot of people have dismissed this text because they say this is a part of what's called the holiness code for Israel, and so that's an Israel-specific thing. And so trying to take these statements to Israel and translate it over to any other culture is inappropriate and is misunderstanding. Well, let's go to the text and let's see if that has merit. That would simplify this whole conversation quite a bit, wouldn't it? The Lord said to Moses, this is chapter 18, verse 1 of Leviticus. Yahweh said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them. So again, this is God speaking, not Moses, right? Moses is passing the message along. I am Yahweh your God. You must not do as they do in Egypt, where you used to live, and you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you in. Wow, that's important. So God is saying, don't be like the people you used to be with. Don't be like the people you're about to be with. You be my people. So you follow my understanding of what life ought to be. Don't pick up your understanding of what life ought to be from all these other folk. Do not follow their practices, he says. Verse 4, you must obey my laws and be careful to follow my decrees. Why? Because he's king. That's the point. I am Yahweh your God. Keep my decrees and laws, for the person who obeys them will live by them. I am Yahweh. God couldn't be any clearer at the beginning. This is my word to you. So this matters more to you than any other opinion, any other word from anybody else. No matter which culture you're in, either it was Egypt back there, it's going to be Canaanites over there. You don't let those standards rule you. You let my standards rule you. This is important for them as a people because they have one king. No one is to approach any close relative to have sexual relations. That's kind of a summary statement out at the beginning, because then he starts to delineate which relatives he considers close, which relatives you are not to be sexual with. And so again, mature content here. Some of these were like, ew, gross. Why would anyone do that anyway? But let's hear God out. Do not dishonor your father by having sexual relations with your mother. Yeah, she's your mother. Don't have relations with her. I don't think any of us would disagree with God about that, right? Do not have sexual relations with your father's wife. That would dishonor your father. You're like, what's the difference? Well, either your father has multiple wives, so don't have relations with the other wife that's not your mother, or he remarried or something. So he's saying, number one, don't have sexual relations with your actual mother. And then even if your father's wife is not your mother, don't do that either. That dishonors your father. Don't have, this is verse 9, don't have sexual relations with your sister, either your father's daughter or your mother's daughter. So that seems to include half-sisters, whether she was born in the same home or elsewhere. Okay, so that's close relative. Do not have sexual relations with your son's daughter or your daughter's daughter. That would dishonor you. Yeah, don't do that with your grandkids. Like, so far, does this seem like these are just peculiar rules for his people that don't apply to anyone else? I'm just trying to be honest with the text. That seems reasonable. I think most of us could be on board with these. Do not have sexual relations with the daughter of your father's wife, born to your father. She's your sister, so there's your half-sister. Don't have sexual relations with your father's sister. She's your father's close relative. Okay, so aunties are off limits. Okay, that makes sense. Do not have sexual relations with your mother's sister. Auntie again. Do not dishonor your father's brother by approaching his wife. So if your uncle has a wife, she's off limits. She's your aunt. Do not have sexual relations with your daughter-in-law. Yeah, that's your son's wife. Hands off. So far, you know what I'm saying? Just looking at the list, just very honestly, none of these seem, I don't know, out of the ordinary or bizarre. They actually seem very reasonable. Do not dishonor your father's brother by approaching his wife. I already said that, didn't I? Sorry. Yeah, verse 16. Don't have sexual relations with your brother's wife, your sister-in-law. Do not have sexual relations with both a woman and her daughter. Yeah. Do not have sexual relations with either her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter. They're close relatives. That's wickedness, he says. Do not take your wife's sister as a rival wife and have sexual relations with her while your wife is living. Great idea. Now, by the way, one of the patriarchs of Israel had done that. Not intentionally, but Jacob married two different women. And what a mess that produced. And I think that's perhaps one reason why this is a really important law for Israel to get a hold of, because it's part of their history as a people. Do not approach a woman to have sexual relations during the uncleanness of her monthly period. Okay, now not everyone would think that's obvious. God makes that clear. Do not have sexual relations with your neighbor's wife and defile yourself with her. Right, if someone's married, hands off. That's a part of the Big Ten, isn't it? Do not commit adultery. Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Moloch, for you must not profane the name of your God. I am Yahweh. Now you're like, that's not sexual. Agreed. But out of sexuality comes children, and God's like, don't you dare take your children that I've given you and sacrifice them to this false God. And that was one of the brutal practices he's trying to warn them against. The people that you're going to encounter as you go into the land, they are doing terrible things, including worship by killing their children as sacrifices. So I don't think any of us disagree with God on this one. 22, and here's the text that we're looking at specifically. Do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is, again, detestable or an abomination. 23, do not have sexual relations with an animal and defile yourself with it. Uh-huh. Are you with me? Like, is that really weird? Or is that like, right on, God, we're with you? A woman must not present herself to an animal to have sexual relations with it. That is a perversion. Correct. The word perversion there means a confusion, which seems to indicate that is totally not clear-sighted of God's order of things. That's confusing things, and he's right about that. Now, out of that whole list, there might be one or two that not everyone's totally thinking that's obvious, but I think for most part, we're looking at those going, yep, God, good list, fair list, we're on board with that. Look at verse 24. Do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I'm going to drive out before you became defiled. Now, this is actually a really important comment, because we can't dismiss this as being Israel specific. If God is saying that all of these sexual practices, and I'm going to emphasize that, practices, with whom you actually engage in sex, if those practices defiled the other nations, then God is saying, in his mind, this is defiling generally, whoever is doing it, not just Israel. Any people who does this is defiled by this kind of behavior. That's actually a really important detail here. He says in verse 25, even the land was defiled. Like the human behavior affected how God viewed the land. So I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. So I'm not trying to read anything into this. I'm just reading it, and it's pretty clear. It's not, if Israel does this, it's bad, but if others do it, it's fine, because they're my peculiar people, but who cares what the rest of them do? God actually was judging the peoples that aren't Israel for doing these exact things. They're vomiting them out of the land, and Israel's going to take a part in that process. But you must keep my decrees and my laws. The native born and the foreigners residing among you must not do any of these detestable things. There's the abomination word. Did you notice? So in the list of sexual things, the man having sex with a man as if a woman is clearly said to be an abomination or detestable in that one verse. But let me just clarify here for those who think that the homosexual sexual sin is like the ghastly one and the rest are just bad. God is actually using the same word for the whole list that he uses for that one. So just to be clear, God's not pointing at that one saying, of all of these, they're bad, but that's the one that's hideous to me. He says they're all abominable or detestable, whichever translation you're using. For all these things were done by the people who lived in the land before you, and the land became defiled. And if you defile the land, it will vomit you out as it vomited out the nations that were before you. Verse 29, everyone who does any of these detestable things or abominations, such persons must be cut off from their people. Look, if you do an honest reading of Leviticus 18, you're seeing a list of sexual practices that God has simply forbidden to his people Israel, but not because they're his people Israel, because this is what he finds detestable, or he finds these to be abominations of the sexual practice. A few observations. Number one, did you notice that except in one case, the person being commanded is the male, the man? Did you notice that? And so that's why there's no reference here at all to female-female sexuality in lesbianism. That's not even mentioned. In fact, if you were to Google lesbianism and Judaism, all the articles I looked at acknowledged the law doesn't say anything about that. So what do you make of that? Well, that's a good question. Okay, I'm not going to get into it at this moment, but the emphasis here is clearly to the men of the community, because the men were expected to lead their homes. They were expected to lead the community. This was simply an assumed that if you command the men and the men do their job, then the women and children will also know the law and will abide by the law also. Now, it's interesting, the one exception is in the bestiality command or prohibition, where it says that a woman must not present herself to an animal. And you see that there, that also still indicates that she's being acted upon. So the women were not allowed, which people of that ancient culture would do this for religious worship. And I'm with you. This is so gross. But anyways, as a part of worshiping their gods, they would interact with animals on a sexual level. And the action of the woman in that case is to present herself to the animal, to make herself available to the animal. Don't do that, God says. But the rest of them are males. Don't do these things, because they would have been more the initiators of sexuality in that culture. That's just an interesting factor of this, I think. And it does reflect the culture of that time, and there's no doubt about that. Now, the other text that we're looking at is in chapter 20, and it's very similar. Now, the thing that is added in this passage in chapter 20 is the specific consequence or punishment if you violate this law. And again, it goes through the list of sexual relations that are forbidden, and it gives you the punishment that will be meted out if you violate this law, or at least the punishment that the community ought to bring down on you. Of course, whether Israel follows through with what God's saying is a totally different question. Now, back in chapter 18, it said, of all of these behaviors, you'll be cut off from your people. Now in chapter 20, that's actually ramped up a bit with several of these. And the truth is that a lot of these are actually punishable by death. That God is actually seeing sexuality to be very important in social life and in interacting with other people. That sexuality is sacred and it matters. And I think that's what people on both sides of this question agree on. It's a very personal, approaching sacred issue, handled properly. Sexuality is a big deal. And that's, I think, no matter which side of this you're on, you can agree with God here that the way that our culture at large is presenting sexuality is ridiculous and sad and tragic even. Not just because, slap your hand, shame on you, you're being a dirty boy or girl. It's not even just that. It's you don't even know what you're handling, this beautiful, sacred thing that God's given us. You're treating it like it's cheap, like it's just for a whim. I mean, if anything's clear here, it's that God takes it really seriously and really wants people to understand it clearly so that they can approach sexuality properly. I just wanted you to know that in the text, along with several others, it is made clear that if a man has sex with another man, lies with, that's the literal, lies down with, which clearly is an indication of sexuality. In this context, lying down can just mean lay down to sleep or something. But when you talk about doing it with another person, the implication is really clear. It's not about sharing a bed with a guy because there's only one bed and you're cold, whatever. This is the same language, by the way. Lying down with is the same language used throughout Genesis and a lot of the narrative that is clearly sexual, that leads to children and stuff like that. You are actually going to be put to death according to the law if you're a man that lies with another man. That's also true of the bestiality. That's also true of adultery. A lot of these sexual sins are met with death. But to be fair, and this is a point made by those who approve of and encourage others to approve of the homosexual life in certain contexts, this also includes a call to put to death those who curse their father or mother. So again, a lot of people use that, putting them together there, they use that to dismiss any of this as being relevant today because, well, do you really want people to go kill someone for cursing their mom or dad? And actually, that's actually not focusing on the main point. Our point isn't to say, should we kill people? That's not even our conversation. I hope that's not what we're wondering. We're in the United States of America. We're not in ancient Israel. So our question isn't who should be killed for doing this or that. Please, I hope that's not on our radar. The question is, does God bless, approve, and embrace certain choices, right? And here, just as God would say, cursing your mother and father is totally forbidden to me, and so much so that someone ought to be killed in that community of Israel to stop that kind of behavior from going on. That's the same extreme consequence for a man who has sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That's Leviticus 20:13. Now, it's been said that because the word abomination applies to food that you're not supposed to eat, then we can't really use that word and take it very seriously when it's applied to something like homosexual sex, the act of actually having sex. I'm not just talking about feelings or attraction. We're going to have to get to that later because the Bible hasn't dealt with that so far that we've seen. In terms of the actual behavior, the actual action of sexuality between two men, at least, since that's called abomination, but hey, so is eating shellfish, so why should we even talk about it? I had to look into that because that's actually a fair point. Christians today eat shellfish. Christians today eat pig, right? They eat forbidden foods to the Israelites. And if those are called abominations, we might have to revisit what the word abomination means. I actually don't think the word abomination is even the main issue, but I wanted to look into it just because that is brought up a lot. I wanted to give you kind of a quick list. And I'm sorry, this is maybe going to be a long video. I didn't want them to be long, but there's a lot going on here, and I don't want to leave things out just for the sake of expediency. But if you wanted to get an idea of this word abomination, because this might come up in conversations you hear about this, the Egyptians considered eating with Hebrew people detestable or an abomination. That's in Genesis 43. So that was a subjective thing for the people of Egypt, right? They personally thought that is gross. No, gag, eating with Hebrews. Oh, they're slaves. So that was detestable to them. That was an abomination to them. In Genesis 46:34, it says that shepherds were an abomination to the Egyptians. I'm like, hey, that's kind of harsh. In Exodus 8, Moses told Pharaoh, look, our sacrifices as Hebrews, our sacrifices to our God would be abominable to you. They would be detestable to you. So just from those three texts, you know that this word could be used very subjectively to what grosses you out, to put it in modern parlance. This is gross to you. You detest this. That's why I think the NIV detestable language is actually pretty helpful here. Now, those are the There are several others throughout the Old Testament that deal with what's detestable to a person, subjectively to a person or a culture. But what we're more focused on is what does God say is detestable to him, right? Because again, our job as disciples of Jesus is to hear the voice of our King and obey him. Try to understand his voice, yes, but we don't wait to understand him to obey. By understand, I mean figure out why he said what he said. If we understand that that's what he said, and we're clear on that, then we're going to obey him. And then we're going to get to trying to find out, now, God, why did you say that? What's your reasoning? Why is this so good? Leviticus 18, as I already mentioned, that word detestable or abomination actually describes everything in the list. So there's a lot of things sexually that God finds to be detestable or as abominations. In Deuteronomy 7, again, I'm going to try to be quick here because you're not going to want to be here all day, I'm sure, but I want to give you an idea. Don't dismiss the use of the word abomination or detestable as God uses it for himself. Because if I can show you the rest of the list, I don't think you're going to walk away thinking, oh, those are just things for the Old Testament. They're not moral issues universally. Well, hold on. Here's the other ways that this word is used by God about what he finds abominable or detestable. Deuteronomy 7, the silver and gold of pagan idols. Yeah, idolatry is universally immoral, right? Big Ten Commandments. That's true into the New Covenant. There's no way anyone could make the case that pagan idols are a good thing or acceptable thing now. They're still detestable. Don't even bring that stuff into your house. Like, don't melt down an idol and bring in the silver or gold and pretend like that's cool. That's not how this works. Deuteronomy 12. Don't worship Yahweh as the pagans worship their gods. They do detestable things that Yahweh hates, like burning children in fire. That's not cultural, right? Like, can we agree on that? That is a universally immoral, terrible thing to sacrifice your children in fire to a false god, right? That's not, hey, you're Israel, don't burn your children. But if you're in America, that's fine. No, no, thank you. Deuteronomy 14, verse 14. Troublemakers leading an entire town to commit adultery against God, idolatry against God, is called detestable. Yes, agreed. That's a totally immoral thing, no matter which culture you're part of. Now, here's the real crux of it. Deuteronomy 14, Moses says this, not God. He's not quoting God. Moses is reminding the people before he dies, before they go into the promised land. Here's what God said. And when he gets to what foods not to eat, this is Moses' comment. Do not eat any detestable thing. Don't eat any abominations. Moses' word, right? Then he goes on to remind them what God had already told them in Leviticus. Animals that don't have both a divided hoof and shoe cut. If they do both or have both, go ahead and eat it. Enjoy. If it only has one or the other, don't, like a pig or a camel, right? Don't eat those. Now, Moses calls them an abomination. Okay, now they were unclean foods, and so Moses, 40 years later, after receiving the law, in his mind, he's put it together that if God said it's unclean, don't eat it, that must be an abomination, food-wise. Now, I just want to caution you. If you hear someone say, since that word is used for food and it's used for homosexual practice, they're both awash in the new covenant, I'm just saying that seems a little too simplistic. Like, again, there's a part of me that wants that to be true. I would love to just dismiss these texts altogether because they're irrelevant, but that's not what I'm seeing. I'm looking at this list, besides that food one, I'm looking at this list of the way the word abomination or detestable is used. Sacrificing an animal with a defect or a flaw. Okay, that's Old Testament specific. But I can understand why it's detestable to God. Because he brings it up later in his prophets. Why are you giving me stuff that's no good? You wouldn't even give that to a human governor. Like, you wouldn't give that to human leaders. Why are you bringing that to the king of the universe? Like, I get it. Bowing down to other gods or the heavenly bodies, sun, moon, and stars. Nah, don't do that. Not just Israel. No one should do that. In Deuteronomy 18, there's a list of detestable things. The detestable things the other nations were doing. Sacrificing children in the fire. We've looked at that. Practicing divination and sorcery. Interpreting omens. Engaging in witchcraft or casting spells, being a medium or a spiritist or consulting the dead, all detestable to God. Is that Old Testament specific? Well, that's a good question, and maybe another conversation. Nations that did detestable things, worshiping other gods. In Deuteronomy 22, wearing the other gender's clothing is called detestable or an abomination. That's, of course, something people today would debate too, whether that's totally immoral just to wear the clothing of the other gender. In fact, one of the debates going on now is whether we should even identify gender that clearly. Is there such a thing as male clothing or female clothing? In Deuteronomy 22, that was pretty clear. And of course, to the ancient Israelites, of course, that wasn't even a question on their mind. Being a female or male shrine prostitute. Now, that's a debate for another, or not debate, a look for another day. But that language is used as a prohibition that is often tied to the homosexual issue, because when you went to worship certain gods, you would go to the shrine where prostitutes were, and sexual activity was a part of worshiping these gods. And you could see either gender and engage in sexual behavior with either gender, hetero or homosexual behavior. And so God's not necessarily dealing with hetero or homosexual behavior. He's just talking about having shrine prostitutes at all. No way. I'm going to stop here, even though there's a whole lot more after this. It's interesting, in Deuteronomy 25 and in Proverbs and elsewhere, having different weights and measures, dishonest scales for the marketplace, is also called abominable. I guess one lesson that we can learn here is whether it's lying lips in Proverbs, the proud of heart, acquitting the guilty, condemning the innocent, hands that shed innocent blood. The idea that God finds certain things detestable shouldn't be shocking to us. It shouldn't make us uncomfortable. If things weren't detestable to God, that would be scary, wouldn't it? If he just, whatever, like hands that shed blood. If God didn't think that was awful, we would have a problem with that, wouldn't we? We'd think, God, how can you not have a problem with this? So I guess what I'm saying is, let's just let the text speak. Let's let God speak for himself without too quickly dismissing what he says, or too quickly latching on to a single issue that he calls abominable or detestable. Let's take it all honestly. If God finds a certain behavior detestable, as he said to the Israelites, one question is, was it just detestable if the Israelites did it, or is it generally detestable? I think the text evidence that we've seen is that even the other peoples of that time that were doing it, God saw it as detestable. And so the land vomited them out. So God's just like, don't be like them, because look how it ended up for them. Not, don't be like them just because I want you to be different. Like, it doesn't matter if they do it, because, hey, they're just them. But you, don't you dare. No, if you were to tell your kids, let's just say me, okay? I've got 4 children. If I were to say to my children, the school you've been going to, the schools you're going to be going to, don't be like all the other students. Because so-and-so got busted for drugs, so-and-so got addicted, and look where their life turned out, so-and-so, whatever. Let's just say it was drugs, right? I said, look at what happened to them when they got caught up in drugs. Now, you're my children. Listen to what I'm telling you. Don't do drugs. It's going to destroy you like it destroyed those children. Yeah, I don't want you to do drugs because you're my children. But that's not why it's wrong if you do drugs because you're my children. That's why I'm pointing to the other examples of those other children. Because it's just terrible. It's bad. It's destructive. And that's what I'm seeing here. I mean, I think it's not perfect, but that's an analogous situation to what God's doing. You saw what happened to those other people when they did these things, plural, not just this one thing of homosexuality, all these other things. You see what happened to them? Don't do that, because it's going to happen to you too if you do. I'm trying to end it here, but I wanted to say one more thing. The idea of putting to death those who violated certain commands seems important to me, because the violation of the prohibition that a man should not lie with a man as with a woman is one of those that is said to end in being put to death. That actually was not true for most of the laws of the Old Testament. And one of the things that bothers me is the way people present God in the Old Testament as just kill everybody. If you do step out of line at all, I'm going to smite you. And that's so dishonest. It's not true. And God doesn't need me to defend him. But while I'm talking about this, I just want to make sure that we understand. People have said, well, if a kid mouthed off to his parents, they'd kill him. No, stop. Don't do that with the text. He's really clear. If you attack your parents or curse them. Now, if you don't know what curse means, you, of course, don't know why that's a big deal. But to curse someone is to call on the power of God or other spirit beings to bring disaster or destruction on your parents. That level of dishonor and disrespect is not just about mouthing off to your parents. God was not like kill anybody who does anything. Look at the actual list, and I'm not going to take all the time to do that with you here. Look at the actual places where God has the Israelites putting people to death, and I think you'll find it's not as arbitrary as it's been made out to be. So if he said to the Israelites, put someone to death who, if they are a man who lies with a man as with a woman, don't just dismiss that because he put everyone to death for everything like that. No. One of the questions I actually have been wrestling with is there anything God said to put someone to death for in the Old Covenant that he is okay with today? There might be some that don't apply today because we don't have a temple or tabernacle, things like that. But in terms of social interaction, is there anything that God says someone should be put to death for in the Old Covenant that he's actually accepting today? Again, I am not talking about should we still be killing people for this stuff. Please, that is not at all on the radar for me. No, I shouldn't be, certainly. If you murder someone, I still think that socially that matches. But that's for the government to do, not for me, certainly. But in terms of all of these other things, do a search, get on your online concordance, your book concordance. Online are really helpful because you can do phrases as you search for where they are in the Bible. But put in the phrase, this is what I did, put to death. I even did a search for the word kill, which didn't have as many results for this. But put to death. Look at the law where it says put to death and what circumstances they are. And you're going to find kidnapping, scheming to kill somebody, hitting someone with a fatal blow, cursing a parent, like I said, striking a parent, or attacking a parent. If you're negligent, so your animal kills somebody, and you knew about it, you knew the animal was trouble, and you didn't do anything to stop the animal, and it killed somebody, right? Adultery, actually, again, a sexual sin that God takes very seriously. And I'll stop there. So, do you have any questions on these texts? Do you think I misrepresented anything, or there's more to explore or discover? Look, I'm trying to be as honest as I can be with my own cultural blinders and all that. I try to acknowledge those, but I'm trying to just be real honest with the text, the language God used, the pattern I'm seeing of how that language is used elsewhere in his law and all that. I just want to know how God feels about it. Not whether we should kill people, not whether we should treat them badly. That's not it. It's just, God, how are you seeing this issue, this behavior? And that's what he's dealing with here. It's the behavior. If a man lies with a man as does a woman, not if he thinks the man's attractive, not if those things. If he lies with a man as with a woman, that God says to the Israelites, and apparently it was true of the other peoples at the time also, he sees that as detestable or an abomination. That's what that text says. Now, what we're going to have to wrestle with as we move into our study is what do we do with that in the new covenant? Does that change? What do we do with that? And that we're going to look into. I don't want to leave that unaddressed, but for now, we've been long enough. Thank you for hanging in there with me. I hope this was instructive to some degree, and I'm certain there's more to look at here in Leviticus. But for an Old Testament text that no longer is in force societally, I still think it's instructive for us on how God views the issue of the activity of homosexual sex. So, God bless you. Let's keep working at this. Let's still be honest with each other and really face the hard questions so that we're clear to be clear to the world with the good truth of God. I love you. God bless you. Let's carry on disciples in the love of Jesus. Whoever we meet, whatever their lifestyle or choices, let's love them like Christ did and tell them the good news. Amen. Bye.